So the UK has had another pretty torrid year for free speech. The police are still happily arresting people for saying things that are supposedly offensive. There's two cases I kind of want to focus on at first before we broaden it out. The Lesbian Nana debacle and the Wakefield Koran scuffing incident. Now, Ella, do you want to remind people a little bit about what happened with this Lesbian Nana case?
Well, there was an incident in which a 16-year-old essentially said to a police officer, "You look like my lesbian nana," in the course of some kind of altercation. And it later transpired that this 16-year-old was autistic, and really was drawing some kind of comparison to her grandmother, who is a lesbian. But it was taken offensively by this police officer who was sort of filmed looking like she was in tears and doing this kind of big performance. And the young girl had proceedings taken against her. And there was this sort of online, it was because it was recorded, everyone's wearing body cams and all the rest of it. It went online. And there was this sort of backlash of saying, hang on a minute, you are, as an adult, trying to take action against a girl who has, called you what you consider to be something mean. But the reason why the Lesbian Nana thing started trending is because the same police officer was then caught on camera a little while after pepper spraying someone. And, so it's obviously an unpleasant individual. But there is...
I think that did look more like a riot, to be fair. But nevertheless, it was amusing that Lesbian Nana rode again.
Lesbian Nana,
it's become an online hate figure.
Yeah.
But the Lesbian Nana is, cries at a 16-year-old sort of criticising her, but is quite happy blinding people in a riot. But there's and taking alongside the incident that happened in Wakefield with the young man who, allegedly kicked and desecrated a Quran, but actually it turned out, again, a young man with, issues himself, and ridiculous sort of overblowing and globalizing of an incident that should have just been a kind of common sense matter. It reminds you of how authoritarian the police can be. And it reminds you that it doesn't matter how many times they march at Pride, it doesn't matter how many times they sort of wear nice things and, go on Twitter and sound all cuddly and friendly. The police can crack heads and are incredibly authoritarian when they want to be. And when it comes to issues of free speech, they are completely over the top. We've had incidents of them, many, many incidents now of people being arrested for stuff they've said on Twitter. You kind of, say the wrong thing, look the wrong way at a police officer. They feel like they have to come down on you. And I think it's because there is this real crisis of authority within the police, which is that on the one hand, they're sort of stripped of all authority because they're encouraged to dance at Pride and do all this sort of stuff, and their brief has been massively overblown. But on the other hand, they feel the need to kind of prove themselves when they can. So that's why you see, I think, one of the only times I've ever agreed with Suella Braverman was her pointing out that there is this sort of double standards in policing, that when they feel like they can lock up a load of people on a lockdown protest, for example, then they will, and they'll go massively over the top. But when they feel like they might be scrutinised on social media for, mishandling a Just Stop Oil protester a bit too harshly, then they won't. And that's a very dangerous situation because essentially you don't have any sort of real rules that the police are playing by anymore.
The two things are definitely connected, like the dancing at Pride and the cracking down on people who express, but a spicy anti-woke meme on the internet. But it's like censorship as a form of PR. It's like state censorship as a way to say, we are on your side. We're not that horrible police force that was found to be institutionally racist or what have you. But the problem is you hand these powers to them, they will also be used in a petty, vindictive, personal way. Like that person said something that's upset me and I have well within my power, especially in that case of that girl from Leeds, because they had arrested her on the basis it was a public order offence, a homophobic public order offence, which she had uttered in her own home.
Yeah.
They were making up as they went along.
Breaking into the house to arrest her. Some people raised the possibility that this itself was unlawful. But there've been a lot of cases of the police being caught breaking the law, applying the law incorrectly. They just don't know that. I mean, we've seen some of their tweets quite explicitly saying things that are not correct about the law. They seem to think. And again, it comes back to the point earlier that we made about the Quangos. The College of Policing has effectively cultivated a generation of activist police officers. It's been it invented non-crime hate incidents out of nowhere. No one told them to do this. they've effectively trained police to believe that it's their job to audit our thoughts, our emotions, our words, to arrest us if we step out of line. And that is connected to the rainbow lanyards and the dancing at Pride and all the rest of it. It's why the police are now being described as the armed wing of Stonewall. It's because this ideology is deeply rooted within it. And I think, to go back to what you said about the Tories, why don't they just abolish the College of Policing before they go? Just scrap it. It's not fit for purpose. They don't appear to know the law, and they're teaching the police to apply the law inaccurately. So get rid of them.
And it's really important to stress that, often people will say flippantly, you can even be arrested for misgendering now. But that's not a joke. You can be arrested for these things, even if it isn't against the law, as you point out. They'll still do it. Tom, could you talk a little bit about the Wakefield Koran incident? Because, I think that's still an example of woke policing, but it's a slightly, perhaps even more sinister bent, where we see the police effectively enforcing Islamic blasphemy law.
Yeah, that was absolutely crazy. From the extent that we can piece the story together, it was that this autistic schoolboy, you were saying, Ella, on a dare, or because this is something that his friends were doing, bringing various holy books into school or something of this nature, brings a Quran into school. They were reading from it, and then they go back into the school building, it gets knocked to the ground, and as it was described in the press, lightly scuffed. As a consequence of this, a local counsellor of Muslim background, as well as one of the local imams, effectively go to the school to discuss this with the school themselves. The school obviously acted very quickly to suspend the boy in question. And the upshot of it was that this boy and his mother and his family were subjected to death and arson threats. And in order to try and make it stop, his mother goes to the local mosque, to the local masjid, to effectively beg for leniency. It was really quite disgusting. The meeting was captured on video, was live streamed, and people have since watched it in full. And there's just this undercurrent of menace to the whole thing, which is to say that essentially for lightly scuffing a holy book, they're at pains in this meeting to say that obviously violence isn't justified and so on, but this shouldn't be an issue. This shouldn't have even led to any kind of expulsion. This at most should have been a clip round the ear, get back to class kind of situation. And one of the striking things about it is in that meeting that took place, you have both the head teacher of the school, who's there just falling over himself to apologise for everything that's happened, and the local chief superintendent who was there. And as you say, he was given the schoolboy in question. All of this death threats, arson threats, the person who ends up with a kind of quasi-criminal record is the child. And that, I think, sums up how much we've lost the plot with this and how much we haven't learned the lessons of Batley Grammar and the other scandals around blasphemy that we've had in recent years. But
I think it just proves that there is something incredibly pernicious going on, which is that we live in a sort of culture of cowardice, which is that nobody thinks that anything can be resolved in a normal way amongst each other anymore. Authorities are brought in at the drop of the hat over everything. The fact that even a school would entertain the idea of external bodies becoming involved in a minor disciplinary action within a school grounds is insane. It's not just insane, it's just an incredible abdication of responsibility. And, the fact that, people might see even on social media, someone misgendering and would decide to call the police rather than, if you disagree with that, have a row, shows that we sort of have, we live in terribly antisocial times. I know it's Christmas, I'm sounding really depressing, but we do, which is that we've lost the ability to rub up against each other, to row with each other, to defend social norms to each other. The prevailing sort of narrative now is that the way in which social change gets enacted and the way in which social norms are enforced is by police officers and by politicians and by law, rather than what it should be, which is that people police each other and that actually change comes from below and is not enforced from the top down. And I think, that feeds into so many big trends that we've been looking at spike throughout the year of,
but
democracy.
Don't you think that use of the state, though, it's very lopsided, though, isn't it? It is kind of hardline conservative Muslims who can weaponize the police force in one way or can count on their cowardice in certain situations. Like, I don't see a lot of TERFs, calling up West Yorkshire Police and demanding that someone who's called them horrible names on Twitter be. And I doubt they'd get a very good hearing if they tried it. So it feels like
perhaps, but it also depresses me that a lot of the sort of gender critical action takes place in the courts. There is this sort of there is this just total abdication of the idea that in normal society, in normal places, people talking, that's where things happen. I mean, I remember, Fraser, when we were still in the sort of COVID pandemic times, you coined the sort of pub test idea, where you said that normally when people sort of figure out how they think about the world, they use the pub test, which is you interact with one another and common sense comes out. And I think we've just lost the ability. I'm sort of, the fact that they've had to appoint Esther McVeigh as common sense officer or whatever in Parliament shows you that I think actually we have to look at ourselves and say, what is it that we're not doing that the sort of normal policing of how we interact with each other has been so taken away from us? I think that's something that we should think about quite seriously, because the people in charge, by the way, and I'm not now starting to sound conspiratorial, but haven't got the view of your average Joe and your average Jane, and there's a sort of a total removal of the political sphere from people's daily lives.
But people are terrified to intervene or to have those conversations. That's a very real problem that I see is only going to get worse, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, if you take the issue of a boy scuffing the Koran and the police getting involved, I mean, the mother going to these local imams, it's reminiscent of that scene in Godfather 2 when the mother of Vito Corleone goes to the mafia boss to say, please don't hurt my son. And that's effectively what she was doing. It's like a mafia racket supported by the police. And the reason I think we've got to address that is that the problem here is that, like Denmark has just banned desecration of religious books. I mean, it's because of the burnings of the Korans in protest, but they've said all religious books. But it's because, and they've said explicitly, we are scared. They've said we've got to protect Danish citizens at home and abroad, and this puts them at risk, right? Sam Harris has rightly pointed out that the Muslim world seems to be, he describes it as uniquely combustible. We do have a situation where people do get killed for addressing this issue. Samuel Paty was beheaded on the street of Paris. The Batley grammar school teacher is in hiding and in fear for his life for showing pictures from Charlie Hebdo. So how do we actually deal with this when the fear is very real? What we should do is sort of say, I mean, as it happens, don't think desecrating a Koran is an effective form of protest. I think it's needlessly provocative. I think it's unpleasant. I just find it gross. I think it has connotations of the Third Reich and all of that kind of thing, of burning books. I don't like it. But in a free society, you should be able to do it in the way that the guys who burnt that effigy of the Grenfell Tower, I found that distasteful, but they should be able to do it without being arrested for it. So how do we actually say, look, what people do with their own copies of books is up to them. We can disapprove. We can express disapproval and protest, whatever you want to do, but we can't get the police involved. How do we do it? It's a serious question. How do we do it when actually people do get death threats? They do get hurt. They do get killed for standing up for free expression. Well, I mean, seriously, what do we do about it?
I mean, one example that comes to mind, because I know we talk about the law and whatever, but it seems to me that the law has a role in, for instance, going after people who are issuing death and arson threats to a mother and her young children.
Right. There's no free speech defence of
no, exactly. It strikes me that that's a pretty clear-cut example in which you would hope that the law would come down on the side of people who aren't menacing and trying to harm people. But I think that goes to that point that we've been going around in this whole discussion, which is the extent to which even the institutions of the state, even if they haven't been captured by these interests, they're terrified of them.
But they don't do it. When Hizb ut-Tahrir called for jihad, they didn't do anything. They said, oh, well, jihad can mean a walk in the park or a meditation or something. Like
in a spiritual struggle.
And it's not just...
they've got no interest in
and not unlike those Ivy League head of universities, it's a similar sort of thing. I don't really want the police deciding what jihad means or any religious concept and what should be. But what I find so striking is that even when you've got situations of true threats, incitement to violence, things like this, things which are not free speech issues by any absolutist sort of definition of it, they're often nowhere to be seen, depending on who the victim and who the perpetrator is. That seems to be the mess that we're in. And it's not to say that these things are easy. I completely understand why the Scandinavian countries and the leadership there are so petrified. I mean, in Denmark, they've just foiled it looks like a Hamas-linked terror plot. Swedish citizens were murdered in Brussels earlier this year because they were Swedish, seemingly because of the Koran burning controversy. It's not to say that this threat isn't real, But at the same time, surely if you're going to be devoting your moral and state resources towards something, it should be protecting those freedoms, not.
So you see it as a
closing
police
upon-
issue. The police should get it because I mean, we failed during the Salman Rushdie affair. But again, what we should have done is the book should have been sold at every bookstore and every media outlet should have been promoting it. That would have been rather than having these endless debates about whether he brought it on himself.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, bookshops in London were firebombed. And I can't be the one to say to a bookstore owner, well, you should just take that risk because that's not really fair.
And a translator was killed, and Rushdie himself was stabbed a few years ago.
Right. So how?
I think it's a bit like what you said about the trans thing. It doesn't happen overnight, but I think that what we have to do is, and I think it is sort of beginning to happen, is normalize the idea that free speech is a good thing, or renormalize the idea that free speech is a good thing. I think that the trans issue has opened a wedge in the door of discussions about free speech. I mean, I remember for years, we've been called, oh, you're just the free speech people, and oh, it's a storm on a teacup, and oh, there's nothing to see here. And I think
can't say that anymore so much.
No, they're not because daily things happen, and too much to even report on. Things keep happening, which is that censorship, and also censorship of the right kind of people. So, not your sort of Nazi pug guy who people feel a bit squeamish about defending, but sort of very liberal feminists and sort of people who are previously in the right onset. Yeah, J.K. Rowling, the most drippingly liberal person in the world, has now become, a hero of free speech, and rightly so. And, I think that people are talking about it more.
Yeah.
And it's little by little. It's people when they realise that it's not just celebrities who get banned, but also porters at Cambridge. And it's, they're kicked out of their jobs for their views. And it's not just a sort of thing that happens out there on Twitter, but it's a thing that happens in the real world. The more that we sort of defend freedom of speech as a means to better political change and the baseline for a free society, I think there's something hopeful in that. And I do think things are starting to change. And, we've got a general election coming next year. All these issues are going to be, I think, framed in terms of whether politicians are able to stand up for the truth and stand up for an idea of open public debate. And I think that's an exciting prospect.
I think if we don't do that, what will happen is that genuinely far-right groups will gain in popularity, I mean, I think it's a big step backward for Denmark to ban Koran burning. Then you have Geert Wilders being elected overwhelmingly, who actually has said he wants to ban the Koran and close mosques. That's the way it could go if we don't promote the free speech aspect. And I fear that I mean, I'd like to be utopian, I like to be optimistic, but I feel like that is the way it's going. Am I wrong about that?
Well, the issue that we're stumbling into, seemingly on the free speech, certainly the right to blaspheme question, but on other ones as well, is that the unwillingness of what we might used to call the liberal elite, not particularly liberal these days, to take on these thorny issues in a forthright way means that you often get in a situation where the only people talking about a particular issue, or the only people willing to go there at certain issues, are because they want to exploit it for nefarious ends.
Right.
But you'd think we'd have learned that lesson.
But that's what I don't want. I don't want this to turn into war on Islam by far-right groups who gain in popularity, or that we think that the only way to address the authoritarianism of Islamofascism is for a new form of authoritarianism that cracks down on
ban
religious
hate
freedom.
marches as the Sweden
Right,
program
by
was
banning
initiated
protests
or
and that kind
whatever.
of that's where I worry this is going actually.
But it's bad for Muslims as well. We talked about this on your show the other week, Andrew. It's like, as far as I'm aware, the only person who has been murdered in this country as a consequence of Islamic blasphemy alleged was an Ahmadi Muslim in Glasgow in 2016. Assad Shah, he was stomped to death by a man from Bradford because of the fact that the Ahmadis are seen as heretics and blasphemers and so on. So it's the minorities within the minorities, it's the dissenting sects, it's the liberal Muslims as well who are thrown under the bus when you allow this stuff to come in, because we have treated these extremists as the authentic voice of British Muslims and worked policy around that, invited them to be community leaders, invited them to advise the police on what is and isn't acceptable. We've got to unpick that. And I get that it's not easy. I get it's going to take a lot of bravery. But at the end of the day, the thing about people who are trying to menace your society or terrorize your society is the extent to which you change that marks their success. There's only so much they can do. There's only so much damage they can inflict. Defend people as much as possible. And those people who are willing to go there, or are willing to be heretics and blasphemers, they should be stuck up for. Even, certainly their rights stuck up for, definitely.